So our first speaker is going to be Dr. Rusche from South Dakota State University. First time to actually meet him, and he's a South Dakotan forever. He has a lot of my background as extension and then several roles at the university, so have some relationship there. He's in a new position about 4 years. Graduate student, Miss Olinger, Grace Olinger. She is Colorado and has moved up to South Dakota. And I only have one South Dakota story. And I have to say, I'm sorry that you sent me one of my students back. Dr. Tracy Jennings, where you at? Where'd Tracy Jennings go? He's sitting way back here at the back. He's one of my former students that went up to South Dakota State, so you might recognize him in your time there. So I'm glad Tracy's here. So I'm gonna turn the mic over to Ms. Olinger. All right, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and she's gonna talk to us about extending days on feed on a Limousin Angus project.
It's just fun.
Yep. Yep.
What's this for short people like me? All right, so thank you for the introduction. Again, Grace, this is my advisor, Dr. Rusche. We'll be talking to you about a study that we conducted at, that we conducted at South Dakota State. That'll be the main component of my research thesis that I'll hopefully be finishing up this fall. I have some serious writing to get started on and doing here through the summer. But anyways, the study is entitled Extended Days on Feed, Influences on Growth Performance, Efficiency, and Carcass Characteristics of Steers and Heifers of Different Proportions of Angus and Limousin Genetics. So just a little bit of introduction. I'm sure that we're all very familiar with the concept of the cattle cycle, but just as a refresher, that's just the recurring expansion and contraction of cattle inventory that occurs over about 8 to 12 years. And typically what dictates that constant ebb and flow of cattle numbers is producer interpretations and responses to certain signals, whether they be prices in markets, feed availability or drought, or even just input costs or things that are maybe more external, like screwworm, which we talked about in great detail this morning. And with that, there's two derivatives that I'm going to mainly touch on that we've been observing kind of at two different intersections of the industry. And that's tighter feeder calf supply as well as decreased slaughter. Currently, we're experiencing a multi-decade low in terms of cattle inventory, and it's projected through the USDA and other platforms that this low will be continuous through 2026. So again, as I touched on, tight feeder calf supply, decreased slaughter. So kind of as a mechanism of offsetting that, cattle feeders recently have been adding days on feed in order to maximize the output of pounds of product on a more limited number of head. And as a result, we've kind of exceeded a hot carcass weight, or we have pushed hot carcass weights to exceed current serial slaughter data sets. There we go. So that kind of brings me to the rationale for this study. We kind of found the need for new research to evaluate growth, efficiency, and carcass outcomes in cattle fed to heavier weights. And it was also important to us to acknowledge that genetics are not stagnant, and there could be some differences associated with different genetic types responses to our consequent management decisions. So I also wanted to go ahead and include this figure just to kind of give you guys a more visual representation, just to show you that cattle getting bigger and heavier is not necessarily a new thing. That being said, today we are definitely able to do it at a more effective and efficient manner. But as you can see from this dressed steer weight graph from 1964 to 2024, you can see that increase in terms of dressed steer weights throughout that time period. So we get a little bit more specific here as we talk about project origination. So the North American Limousin Foundation initiated discussions around evaluating Limousin, Limflex, and Angus sires. Now provided funding and identified several cow herd cooperators that we could partner with throughout this project. And then Dr. Bob Weber also and Kansas State were very hands-on with sire selection and what sires were going to be used throughout this project. And then when the calves finally arrived to us at South Dakota State, we were tasked with the management of those cattle post-weaning and collecting data all the way throughout the feeding period in relation to dry matter intake as well as growth performance. And then we also follow those cattle through the plant to collect carcass data as well. So the objectives of this study were to, one, investigate how adding days on feed and affects dry matter intake, average daily gain, and feed to gain as cattle approach heavier harvest weights. Two, we wanted to determine how longer feeding periods impact carcass composition and grade distributions. And three, we wanted to assess how differences in sex and breed type can affect response to extended days on feed. So we're going to move a little bit more into the specifics of this study with materials and methods. So as far as genetic management is concerned, there were 453 commercial Angus cows from 2 Montana ranches that were artificially inseminated in 2022 to 9 sires, with 3 of each Limousin, Limplex, and Angus, equal representation of those breeds. And then the cleanup bulls that were used were also representative of those contemporary groups. And then upon birth, they used DNA to go ahead and confirm sire ID as well. But even prior to that, there was a lot of emphasis taken on behalf of Dr. Weber, as well as the NALF board, to put some extra selection pressure on what sires they were going to use for this study. So all of the bulls were selected using 2021 EPDs, and the goal really was to use Meat Animal Research Center adjustments to achieve similar growth estimates. Those bulls were born from 2015 to 2019. The purpose behind that was so that those bulls had sired enough calves to be considered proven, and then they could attain their accuracy at least 0.4. So this table is just a little bit of a better illustration of how those bulls kind of shook out from an EPD standpoint. As you can see, does this have a pointer? Maybe? Yeah, okay. As you can see, carcass weight, which was considered our output, was where a lot of the focus was made in terms of making these sires equal. It's important to note too that in general, the Angus sires were a little bit better in terms of fat and marbling, not necessarily super surprising there. We're also noted to be a little bit lesser in terms of ribeye area. The Limousin cattle were inverse from that respect, higher in terms of ribeye area, a little bit lower in terms of fat and marbling, and then the Limplex sires felt intermediate for pretty much all of those traits. So again, we'll go ahead and move into initial processing. Many of you probably do not know Weston, but it was too good of an opportunity not to include this fun Snapchat jam of one of my lab mates. This was the first time that Weston got to pour. And for those of you that can't see the caption, it says, "It's like art, I'm Picasso, and this is my canvas." So like I said, just a good opportunity. These obviously aren't my calves, as evidenced by the little yellow hairs sticking above the alley, but I just thought I'd go ahead and include it anyways. But anyways, 216 calves that resulted from the 2022 matings were delivered to the Ruminant Nutrition Center in Brookings, South Dakota in November of 2023. Upon arrival, those calves were vaccinated for viral respiratory pathogens, Clostridial species, and topically administered moxidectin by our friend Weston. And all of those calves were implanted with a 36 milligram Zeranol. Throughout the time that they spent at the RNC, those calves were fed twice daily to achieve a programmed gain target of 2.5 pounds per day until January 24th, which would have been their last day spent at the RNC before they moved to our cow-calf unit on campus. As far as experimental design is concerned, those calves, as I mentioned, were moved to the Cow-Calf Education and Research Facility on January 25th of 2024 and placed in one of 3 pens, approximately 72 head per pen. Those cattle were fed the same diet ad libitum pretty much through the entirety of the study. We were able to collect intake data via our Incintech system at the cow-calf unit. There are 12 nodes per pen in each of those 3 pens. And once those cattle were locked in, the fact that we use the Incintech also accommodated our ability to be able to provide MGA to heifers throughout the duration of the study. Also included on this slide is just a little bit of a diet table, pretty straightforward, stereotypical Midwestern ration. Also with the implant study, I just want to go ahead and clarify this timeline a little bit because it can be a little bit confusing in the manner that the days are organized. So you can see, oh, there we go. You can see right here at CCRF, the day that we transported them to the cow-calf unit is what we actually refer to as day 1 of the study. The days prior that were spent at the RNC are all referred to as negative days in the study. So as far as implant study is concerned, those cattle were implanted again on day -58 with that 36 milligram Zeranol implant, on day 28 with a 100 milligram trenbolone acetate and 14 milligram estradiol benzoate or a Synovex choice, and then on day 104 with a coated 200 milligram trenbolone acetate and 28 milligram estradiol benzoate implant or a Synovex 1. And then on day 141, those cattle were resorted to harvest groups in accordance to equivalent body weight and equal breed representation, as well as sire width, inbreed, and sex also being made equivalent. For statistical analysis, this is kind of the bland part. We use prox limits. The model include fixed effects of breed, sex, and days on feed with a random effect of source herd. For estimates of change coefficients for days on feed, the same model was used except for days on feed was used as a covariate. And now we get into the results. For the most part, these cattle kind of read the book and did a lot of the things that we expected them to do, but I'll go ahead and dive into that nonetheless. So in reference to effective breed and sex on growth, performance, and efficiency, in terms of sex differences, steers and heifers really performed as we expected. Steers were higher in terms of average daily gain and dry matter intake, not necessarily surprising. As far as breed differences go, breed did not have an effect on average daily gain or final body weight. However, increased Limousin influence did result in reduced dry matter intake, which also correlates to improved feed to gain as well. In terms of effective days on feed on growth, performance, and efficiency, again, kind of what we would expect. Body weight increased as we added days, nothing very mind-blowing about that. Dry matter intake and feed to gain also increased with added days on feed. So bigger cattle were eating more and feed to gain got poorer or they became less efficient towards the end of the feeding period, which again isn't super surprising. In terms of effective breed and sex on carcass characteristics, there were several breed differences worth noting. Increased Limousin influence increased ribeye area and reduced rib fat, resulting in more favorable numerical yield grades. So I think when we think back to that 2 slides ago, when we talked about those Limousin cattle also being more efficient, I think there's probably a physiological attribute to be noted there, because when we talk about at the end of the feeding period, those cattle are typically starting to use less of their feed to put on muscle, right? More of that's going to be allocated towards fat deposition. You can almost make an argument that the Limousin growth curve was just stretched maybe a little bit further, and they were still participating in more protein accretion that increased ribeye size, less fat deposition that we observed with the decreased ribeye, but that's just a little physiological tidbit there. Angus influence increased marbling score. Limplex cattle, interestingly, had a very similar proportion of premium carcass grades when compared to Angus, and yet they did it in a little bit more efficient manner, similar to the Limousin cattle. As far as sex differences are concerned, steers had heavier hot carcass weights and larger ribeyes. Again, not super surprising. And heifers had more rib fat and higher yield grades, but that was also accompanied by higher marbling scores. One interesting thing that we did notice, especially between steers and heifers on the carcass side of things, is that as we added days on feed, we did actually change marbling on the steer side of things. We added marbling at a more notable pace in the steers than we did the heifers. Again, I think there's probably a physiological explanation in terms of the heifers being earlier maturing and just having less capacity to change marbling as we went later into the feeding period. They had probably just already attained more of that maximum potential prior to us, I guess, paying attention. As far as effective days on feed on carcass characteristics is concerned, hot carcass weight increased as we added days on feed. Ribeye area, rib fat, and yield grade all increased with days on feed, and the percentage of hot carcass weights over 1,100 pounds, this is particularly in reference to steers, increased as we added those days on feed. So here's just a couple figures to just more visually summarize some of the things that I've gone over. So this first figure on your guys' left is a comparison of dressing percentage between steers and heifers. As you can see, the steers in the blue column, that dressing percentage increases as we add increases from Angus, increases as we added days for Angus and Limousin and Limflex. Again, we didn't really see that same response in heifers. I think you can attribute that to the similar physiological explanation. For figure 2, that's the quality grade distribution by breed. You can see, let me clarify the columns for you first. Yellow is Angus, blue is Limflex, and the navy color is Limousin. You can see that Angus and Limflex are very, very similar in terms of the amount of premium graded carcasses that they had. While Limousin did not have any in the prime grade, they actually have very, very few in the select, so they remained very concentrated in terms of that choice grade as well. Figure 3 demonstrates the percentage of hot carcass weights over 1,100 pounds. Really didn't start to see that until that 235 days on feed. Again, it's mostly just applicable to steers, but there were a couple big heifers on day 270 that did manage to reach that threshold. Figure 4 is the percentage of yield grade 4s and 5s by sire breed. Not super surprising. The Angus had the greatest proportion of those throughout the feeding periods, followed by Limflex and then Limousin in total. And then again, just to kind of summarize everything in a neater package, we went ahead and found some slope estimates that are better at describing the changes over the feeding period on a day-to-day basis. The big one that I want to point out within this entire table is hot carcass weight. So if you look underneath the steers, those steers, geez, I keep doing that. There we go. Steers were gaining hot carcass weight at about 2.16 pounds per day. And then over here, we can see that heifers were at 1.78 pounds per day. And if any of you are at all familiar with any of Galleon's cereal slaughter data and studies, it's astonishingly very, very similar from a slope estimate perspective. So that was something that we found very interesting. But with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rusche. There's that.
Thank you, Grace. So what I'm going to do, I appreciate your willingness to let us do this tag team. We like to show off our grad students, and so I wanted to give her the opportunity to give some of the production data. I'm going to try to put some numbers to this. Bear with me. I am an animal scientist practicing economics without a license. So bear with me as I go through some of these, but we will try to put some dollars and cents to some of the differences we observed. So first, I'm going to lay out some of the assumptions that I used to calculate this, starting off with how I calculated final value. We ship these cattle to Cargill and Schuyler, Nebraska, and the values I'm going to show are reflective of what we sold cattle for in the late summer, early fall of 2024. I used a base price of $310 a hundred. That's based on a choice yield grade 3. You can see on this slide, the select discount on that grid was a -20. They were offering a $6 premium for certified Angus beef and a $20 premium for prime. As we get into the yield grade and carcass weight discounts, they offering some modest premiums for yield grades 1s and 2s. They discount us at $5 for a yield grade 4. I should note that's on the first one. Our other market that we will ship research cattle to would be Dakota or Tyson at Dakota City. On that particular grid, they allow, I think it's 14 or 15% yield grade 4s before they start discounting us. From the standpoint of calculations, this is cleaner because we're paying it on carcass number 1. Our yield grade 5 discount on this grid was a -14. This particular grid pays a little extra if we hit between 850 and 1099 in terms of carcass weight, to the tune of an extra $2, and the discount of a -15 once we cross over the 1100 carcass weight threshold. To determine on the cost side, what I did is I took the weight when we transferred those over to the cow-calf unit and used then the prices that were being paid in South Dakota for feeder cattle for steers and heifers that week in January. I pulled up the USDA weighted average report, did a linear regression for the steers and the heifers. That was had a linear and a quadratic term to try to explain that price curve. And then I used that equation to derive an estimate of what those cattle might have been worth had we been buying them out in the marketplace in South Dakota. Our diet cost that I used for this was $200 a ton per ton of dry matter. For some of you, that may seem low. However, I live and work in perhaps the widest corn basis place in North America. And when I recalculated the diets that we fed based on today's feed costs, I came up with about 190. So this is reflective of the environment that we fed those cattle in. And so I thought it was appropriate that if we're feeding cattle in South Dakota under South Dakota with Midwestern kind of diet under South Dakota weather conditions, that I use South Dakota feed costs in order to do that. Included a yardage charge of 50 cents per head per day, and we can debate whether that's appropriate or not, but I felt important to include that. I also included an interest cost because as we were talking about over the last 2 days, that is becoming a more important component, especially as these cattle get more valuable. And in fact, the daily interest charge actually is more than what the yardage charge was when we get out to the end of the feeding period. But I wanted to recognize that there is an opportunity cost in terms of financing to add days on these cattle. The final values come directly from the Cargill settlement sheet. You'll notice here in a few slides that on one of them, when I do a marbling score distribution, that the number of marbling scores less than 400 and the number of selects don't necessarily match. If we were writing up a research report on a feed additive, we'd have taken those 390s and called them select. In this case, for the economics, if Cargill paid us for a choice, it's a choice in terms of the income side of things. So again, these are all net estimates. As you know, as I've talked about, our feed costs might not apply to you, so your mileage may vary. But I think in terms of relative ranking, I'm hoping that what we've done may reflect how these cattle might perform under a wider variety of environments. So we've talked, and I think the presentations earlier this week have set this talk up really, really well about the signals to add days on feed and increase output. And if you need further evidence of that, of why cattle feeders are doing just what I'm showing here, here it is. As we fed cattle longer, those cattle were more profitable. Plain and simple. Now you might look at that and say, well, you didn't have to go quite that long. They were, we're showing almost a $300 profit on day 200. I can tell you, and you'd be right, we could have cut days and still made money. However, when we put those cattle on feed and when the university took ownership of those, trust me, it was not inherently obvious that we were going to make that kind of possible returns. As Dr. Perkins maybe alluded to, I've had a kind of a winding career path, and I spent about a dozen years on our family's operation, where between my parents and my wife, we were managing up to about 300 cows. So I spent a fair amount of time selling feeder calves, and I never felt like, I don't think I ever felt like, gosh, they overpaid me. I always thought, gosh, I think they could have paid just a hair more. Now I find myself on the other side, and every time we buy some cattle, I think we paid a little too much. So it's funny how life happens, but certainly at the time we took those, we were a little concerned. Maybe, boy, this is getting a little hot. Perhaps we didn't, so it wasn't intuitively obvious that we're going to have this kind of potential return. And also, so when we are, and give another little background story. We just bought a set of cattle for a research project. I think we bought them about 3 weeks ago. 600-pound cattle in Yankton, South Dakota. Laid in cost for light 6 weights into our research yard is just shy of $2,500. I thought that was actually pretty good because if the same kind of cattle in Fort Pierre the week before were $150 higher, my department head didn't completely share my opinion that I'm a really frugal cattle buyer. But when we do the projections, those cattle have to get big for us unless this market continues to run up. Those cattle have to get big in order for us to clear. In this particular case, in this study, we got helped out by a rising tide. It lifted the entire market, which let those calves be as profitable as what you see right here. When I break it down by sire breeds, and again, we're gonna talk some on breed differences. All 3 of these sire groups fed well, were profitable. Gosh, give me a set like any one of these, we're good. But there were some differences. And in this instance, the cattle with more Limousin influence, using the assumptions I put together, were more profitable than the Angus sired cattle. When I break it out by by slaughter group and by breed, we start to see a few more differences. Now, I'm going to caution you that each one of those bars represents, by the time we break out 3 different sire groups, 3 different kill groups, each of those bars only represents about 24 head. So, 1 or 2 can have some real outside influence. So we need to be careful not to read too much into some of these. But one of the things that I noticed is, as we added days, there was an advantage that it seems that the Angus and Limflex cattle had a greater advantage to being fed longer compared to the Limousin cattle, Limousin sired cattle. And so, my next couple slides are my attempt to dig into that and think about why. I am really good at figuring out what we should have done after all the answers come in and we get the closeouts. I'm pretty poor at predicting things. I would not have expected, and I would have undersold those cattle if you'd asked me to call quality grade distribution like Grace had showed you. These cattle graded extremely well. I also would have made some mistakes on grid marking, and I'll show you those here actually in this next slide. So my next step then to try to understand how did that day on feed and breed sire type interplay was to just figure out what was our price per pound when we sold them on those grids. I'm going to tell you, those group on that day 200, I think that might have been the best cattle from a grid performance standpoint we've ever sold. That's close to a $6 to $7 grid premium. That group of cattle absolutely nailed it. But as I just showed you, it wasn't necessarily the most profitable. In the case of the Limousin sired cattle, we dropped about around $4 to $5 in comparison, a greater drop compared to the cattle that were sired by the Angus or the Limflex bulls. And so, which again, all of those things I was thinking about were I had to think about why is that happening. We've got the Limousin sired cattle were more efficient, didn't have as many yield grade 4 discounts. And the final answer was when we presented this data, when Grace presented this data at the Plains Nutrition Conference in San Antonio, the final speaker of that program is Dr. Marshall Streeter with Merck Animal Health. That organization's done almost probably as much work on cereal slaughter data as any organization in the country. And he broke down some things in terms of marbling score. And when I did that, then this started to make a little more sense. Now, so what I'm showing you here is the marbling score distributions based on the carcass results for the Angus and the Limflex sire group. Now, we don't get paid on marbling score, but marbling score dictates where cattle land in terms of quality grade categories and how we get paid on grids. If you look in the 2 yellow bars, vertical bars represent the upper and lower bound of the choice grade. So you can see on both of these groups, we had relatively few that fell into the select. The Limflex, that's kind of that odd one. Remember I said we had cattle that were, the camera said they were a high 300, but we got paid as if they were low choice and took the money. That's the group. That's what was happening with a few groups off of that breed sire group. You can also see though, this distribution is skewed a bit to the right. We've got some cattle that were into the prime category, where we captured some prime premiums. If I compare that to the cattle that were sired by a Limousin group, this one, we had very few to the left of that line, but none to the right either. And that reflects, I think, some of the crossbreed EPD differences that Grace shared with you, where there was some differences in terms of their genetic potential for marbling. It showed up in terms of our actual results when we got to the carcass. Group of cattle that, from a choice or better standpoint, did extremely well. We just didn't have enough of any of those, enough of that tail off to the right to where we could pick up some prime premiums. So as we added days on feed, Grace showed you that regardless of breed, as we made those steers heavier, more of them went across the 1,100 pound line. And at that point, that's about $165 discount. The Limousin sired cattle had fewer cattle in the yield grade 4, but there were some, and they increased as we added days on feed, like you'd expect. So we started picking up some yield grade 4 discounts. And so the net result was there wasn't the opportunity to offset some of the discounts with prime premiums, so it changed what that net result was. Need to also keep in mind that I gave you a static snapshot, but we don't work in a static world. We work in a world of dynamic markets and changing conditions. And so, and it's just as an example of that, I did a bit of a thought experiment to say, well, what happened if I made the diet cost $275 instead of $200? For us, that's roughly equivalent of a $5.50 corn. In that case, you can see there's some greater differences in terms of where some of these sire groups shake out. Even in spite of that added diet cost, it was still more profitable to add days on feed on most of the cattle. And so I'm going to wrap up and then get to some conclusions. Not sure how we're doing on time, Dr. Perkins, but I'm going to give you kind of my thoughts on all this. There's been a lot of discussion in terms of cattle size, carcass weight, where's the future hold? I am not here to pretend that I'm smart enough to predict what that might be. I can tell you that at least under the conditions of this experiment, adding days on feed, we made cattle heavier, we made cattle fatter, and we made more money doing so. As Grace talked about, the steers and heifers read the book. They performed exactly as we would expect. In this experiment, sire breed did affect carcass outcome and value. As we increased Angus influence, we improved marbling and quality grade. Probably not surprising, and especially not surprising given what she showed you in terms of how those crossbreed EPDs squared out. Also, we increased Limousin influence, we increased cutability, and we improved feed efficiency. And in this case, in this experiment, using some genetic complementarity from a sire standpoint by combining genetics that have some advantages on both the marbling and on the cutability side, ended up improving results, particularly as we increased weights. I need to recognize the team. Feedlot research, nest issues, a team sport. And I need to recognize then our leader and our captain and our coach, Dr. Zach Smith. He's on the upper left of this picture. He is unfortunately not able to come because he's participating in some oral prelims today. And then we have a dissertation defense tomorrow, which avoided us having a disagreement because I really wanted to come here, and so did he. And well, when we found out there's a conflict, Dr. Odie suggested, well, maybe you could have shifted a defense. I said, no, man, this is an easy way for me to get to come to BIF and avoid the argument. This is our group. We don't get to picture ourselves all that often. In fact, Grace said, I think this is the first time I've made the picture, so I'm glad we did. You'll notice I'm up behind the tallest people in the front row on the far left. My wife took that picture. She's an art teacher and an artist, and she understood where to place me to make the best picture. Need to make some acknowledgements. First and foremost, I think this is the most complicated project we have ever undertaken. The grad students in the room, when you go back home, go tell your advisor you'd really like to take on a 3x3x2 factorial experiment and see what the reaction would be. That's exactly what we've saddled Grace with 3 sire groups, 3 kill groups, and steers and heifers. So it's complicated. From the standpoint of pulling this together, it's complicated. Mark told me I didn't need to thank him, but I think I need to because he and his board put an awful lot of work into putting this together, finding the cooperators, the level of organization it took to order to pull this off. As Grace mentioned, this is a project that's been at least 4 and pushing 5 years in the making. It's given me a whole new appreciation for the work that, the folks at USDA Clay Center and other places have done. We literally stand on the shoulders of giants, that the work they have done for this industry. I hope that, we continue as an industry, continue to allow and encourage that kind of work to happen because the problems we're being asked to solve are not going to get simpler as we go forward. Recognize the 2 cooperating ranches, Hamlet Ranch and Valley View Ranches in Montana. Also want to recognize, I skipped one, the folks on the North American Limousin Research Foundation Board. These are the folks that made this happen by their financial commitments. With no guarantees they were going to like the results. They took a pretty big leap of faith and they deserve some credit, all the credit, for making this project happen. 2 individuals that do an outstanding job at our place of taking care of livestock, a couple of the best stockmen I've ever met. Paul Schlobum at the RNC, he took care of the cattle while after arrival, prior to being placed on test. And then Mr. Kevin Vanderwall during the test period, he's responsible for the cow-calf unit in the Ensign Tech barn. I put our email addresses up in case anyone has any questions. Unfortunately, as much as I would love to stick around for the rest of the program, as I mentioned, Dr. Smith has a dissertation defense tomorrow. I'm on that committee, and it's really important for me to get back to that. Grace is going to take the opportunity of this trip to visit her family in Colorado. We haven't always given her as many chances to do that. But in order for both of those things to be accomplished, we need to be on the flight to Denver at 5:30. So, this depends on whether or not the questions we got are really hard. This might be good. And Grace, this is the point where you need to have that lift order just in case. Otherwise, if they're not hard, gosh, I'm sorry I have to leave so early, but we'd be happy to address any you get. Dr. Dyke.
Did you and Grace get to split the profits?
Maybe I need to work at Kansas State. Yeah, it's odd that, no, they give us an attaboy, good job, but no, they are not paying us more for for putting together a set of cattle that actually makes some money, unfortunately. They also don't make me make the losses whole, and it is a whole lot easier to spend several $100,000 of the university's money when it's not my checkbook. Yes, sir.
These were, the 3 breed groups were they Angus sired? Or they were purebred Angus?
So the question was, I think, as you understand it, are you talking breed makeup on the cow side?
Yeah.
So, and I'm going to defer a bit. I see Mark is nodding his head, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is these are commercial Angus cows. I know there's a couple. I did not see the cow, but the people that have their description was pretty average, typical kind of commercial cows that you might find in Montana. Is that?
Then the other 3 groups, Rusche and Limousin, were they half Angus?
So all of those sire groups were bred to the same set of cows. So the Angus sire group, those calves we saw would have been nearly 100% Angus. The Limflex sired, I'd have to look the exact quarter. Most of the quarter blood. The Limousin sired are going to be close to half. And I'm speaking very general terms, but.
All black.
The question was, were they all black? There were a handful of red cattle in the group. I couldn't tell you the exact number. 5,
2, 3.
yeah, there weren't many. Yes, sir.
Understanding that you set the sire selection equal on growth rate or yearly weight, how well do you feel the composition, the implied composition growth, ribeye area, and fat EBDs reflected that breed averages for breeds?
I'm going to defer that to Mark or Dr. Weber if he's in the room.
I think as Warren mentioned, Dr. Weber, when he started, the first thing they looked at was calf, and he said, then the growth traits, to try to get some equivalency. You kind of saw that when the calves got off the range. If you remember, the Angus sires, quite a bit of lead with the US park adjustments. I mean, Limousin Lynn Flex calves had some wood to chop, or the sires, and the progeny of those sires. But that also kind of showed up. I think the Angus calves weren't raised, they were like 7 pounds bigger than to some extent, but they kind of get little fake DVDs doing that work. But as they march through the line, it's tough to get automatic balance. Angus has got a big population of cattle, and of course, we're much smaller. So the first requirement of the board at that time, we used proven sires, at least like a 44 for accuracy. So when we got across the weight traits, and then we balanced stuff with cavities, so we didn't create any problems. I will say on the commercial Angus cows, one range was kind of a moderate, smaller frame kind of cow. And they're still popping 15, 16, 1700 pound progeny, so that's kind of an eye opener. And the other range, maybe a little bigger frame Angus cow. It is pretty tough after you do the weight traits to find an equivalency because of the size of our herd set. So you had Marlowe scores much higher on the Angus sires, of course, and that makes sense. And you saw that difference in the ribeye to some extent too, because of what he's got for muscling. But it was basically, we got out of the way and let Dr. Ware do that. If you get a corner today, he can probably give you a little more detail on this topic for it.
Did you use, when you showed the more revenue with more net return as they were in feedlot operating, did you freeze the price? I heard you say the price got higher and that's part of the reason.
So the question was that revenue or profit as for each day group, I used the actual results for that kill group. So for that 200 group with the profit, that was what the return we got on the set of cattle that were killed on day 200. When we got to day 235, I used the same grid because we had some variation. As it turned out, the market went a little south in September. So in the real world, they didn't quite do as well, but that nothing to do with the cattle. It just had to do with the cattle market in general. What I'm hoping, I hope I'm answering your question. Those profitabilities are based on their actual carcass measures using that standard grid that I outlined on the front end. Does that make sense?
Same price all the way through.
Same price all the way through, 310 base, same grid. So yeah, I had to, otherwise you're gonna get lost. We're gonna get lost if we don't.
Parity differences between the cows, it breaks, did you look at that?
So the question was, were there parity differences between the cows? I have no idea. That would be Mark. I'm guessing this is just the run of the cows they had. They set them up and synchronized them. Those that responded or those that would stuck. My involvement was when the truck backed up and we unloaded them. So I guess I've fully gone over to the dark side. I'm now a feedlot guy.
One ranch had some of that Angus cows, and we were originally gonna send 198 up in the test groups. But we took some of the extras and there was a few cleanup calves that we just took for backup. So there was like 3 of those calves that were out red Angus cows, and that's why we had a handful of red cattle in it. But the majority of the calves were all out of Angus commercial cows, 2 different ranches, maybe probably 2 different scores on frame size on the calves. Just to try to standardize them, it's the best we could.
And from a statistical standpoint, we did include herd in the model to try to account for that. Yes, sir, in the back.
Dr. Rusche, to that previous question on holding the base price and the grid the same, I think, so what you're talking about, that makes a lot of sense. Have you all worked through that math? If you did not make sense. And the reason I ask is because if we make the decision to extend days on feed by X amount, we're also subjecting ourselves to the risk of volatility in the market. So I'd just be curious to know what, if you all have done that and what that is.
I haven't, that'd be a good one. I can tell you they would have, we didn't get nearly the benefit then from going from August to September, but we got some of that back in October. Right now, the argument would have been, man, the worst thing you could have done is sold cattle early because this thing just keeps climbing. The other part of that we hadn't touched on, and it didn't bite us too bad, but every day we own them is one more day for one of those steers to come up with a way to die. And, that impact of late term deads It's one thing when we were selling fat cattle for 115 live, now we're somewhere around 240, 380 dressed. That bill becomes large. In fact, the 1% death loss, that might be enough to take us from potentially profitable down to a loss. At around $40, near $40 per head. So yeah, there's an element of risk, both from the market standpoint and from the mortality standpoint by extending days. I think we need bigger data sets to probably really capture it, but yeah, it is an absolute a real risk. It's something we're gonna have a discussion when we get back is, we've got a set of cattle that, last year we took them out into September. I am by nature a bit conservative. My discussion is going to be, I think Paul might need some time to get yards ready and maybe we can put wheels under them because as Dr. Dykeman asked, I don't get paid extra for making more money. Maybe we get some cattle moved and empty the yard and take a bit of a break. But you know, that added risk for added days is a real concern.